Today on Oklahoma Gardening, host Casey Hentges will identify a common problem with young seedlings and have steps to prevent it. We put the finishing touches on our keyhole garden project. Casey cuts back ornamental grasses and divides them for replanting. And we have tips for evaluating and cleaning up storm damage in our trees. Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance is provided by TLC, Oklahoma's leading garden center, Southwood Landscape and Nursery, Tulsa's source for great gardens, and the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing.
So many of you are probably beginning to think about what seeds you want to plant in your garden this year, and you might even be starting them early inside somewhere. A lot of times this is a simple thing to do, but you might encounter a problem if you're seeing some of your seedlings start to die. And I want to share with you guys what's happening to some of our seedlings here. And this is a thing called damping off, which is a fungus that attacks your young seedlings when they're most vulnerable. It also can attack some larger plants, but usually that results in crown rot or root rot. In young seedlings, though, this tends to start right at the soil line, and you'll see these seedlings turn brown at the soil line. As it grows up, eventually your seedling will just fall over and die. Sometimes this attacks seeds prior to germination, and the seed will just turn mushy and brown. And sometimes it attacks the roots, and it takes a while for you to start noticing it up above on the seedlings. Overwatering and cool soil temperatures also encourages damping off. I'm going to pull one of these up so you guys can kind of see what we're talking about. And you can see on this lower part of the stem right here at the soil line, you can see how it's turning brown right there and shriveling up. Eventually this is going to keep going up the stem and cause this seedling to die. But that's what has weakened it right there, causing it to fall over, so that you know that it's already affected by the dampening off. I'm also going to pull up a healthy one here. Well, the one that's not showing signs just yet. And you can see how the stem is green all the way to where it meets the roots. So at this point it hasn't been infected by the pathogen yet, but if it was to stay in here much longer, it probably would. Or it's just not showing the symptoms just yet. So you want to make sure that you're using sanitized equipment. This is one of the best ways to prevent your seedlings from damping off. So we have new potting containers here that we're going to use. A lot of times people will recycle some of their old containers, and that's fine. Or they might even use old food containers. And again, this is perfectly fine, but you want to make sure that's sanitized first. So one of the best ways is to use a 10% bleach solution and soak those containers for about 30 minutes just to really make sure that they're clean of those pathogens. Now, the other thing you want to make sure you use is new potting media, because this has been sterilized before you get it. The other thing is it's got a lot of good structure still in it. If you have old potting media, a lot of times people want to use that, but I say that that's best to just go into the compost pile. Now, you can see here in our seedlings, we've got this damping off that's starting to occur. Again, it starts at the soil line there in this case, and it's working its way up some of the seedlings. What happens is it spreads pretty rapidly. So we have overseeded this little container. There's way too many seedlings in here, and that prevents good airflow between those seedlings, and that also encourages that pathogen to really spread. So this is not an ideal situation. What we should have done would be to put 1 or 2 seeds in a 6-pack. This will allow plenty of airflow, and it will allow those seedlings to have their best chance of growing in a new, clean container with new potting soil. So if you're directly sowing your seeds outdoors, you want to make sure that your bed has good drainage and also that the soil isn't compacted. Having a lot of moisture in the soil is what allows this pathogen to grow quickly and cause that damping off in the seedlings also. So I hope this gives you a good idea of what causes damping off, and if you see your seedlings start to decline, know that that's what you're dealing with, and it's best to just really prevent it in the beginning with good sanitation, good airflow, and also not overwatering your seedlings. Last week we gathered the materials and built the structure for our keyhole garden. This week, it's time to fill it and get it ready for planting. So now that we have our exterior wall built, what we're going to do is use cardboard to lay down and help suppress that grass from growing, that Bermuda grass. A lot of times I would suggest people to use cardboard to prevent Bermuda grass from coming up in new beds instead of using weed fabric. So now that we have the bottom of the garden lined with cardboard, we're also going to line the sides behind the wall with cardboard as well. Some people use different items again to line this, but I like the cardboard because it will decompose. So we're using all organic material here. But also the cardboard helps hold that moisture in, which allows this garden to be a more water conserving garden, and you don't have to water it as often that way. So now that we have the cardboard fairly in place, as we add stuff to it, it'll help hold that cardboard in place even more. The next thing that we're going to add is some sticks. Now, you don't want to put too large of branches in here just because they won't decompose as well. So we're using about 1/2 inch to 1.5 inch branches. And we're simply going to layer these in here on top of the cardboard. You do want to mound the sticks a little bit higher towards the inside of the cage because the whole garden is going to slope away from the cage. It's important to water between each layer as you add it. This allows that material to soak up that water, creating that sponge effect, which is really beneficial for the plants. So as you can see, there's quite a variety of material that goes into a keyhole garden. We've used a lot of different dead plant material, and it's a great way to get a garden ready for the spring by taking all of that dead plant material out of your garden and utilizing it here. Now, we've got a lot of carbon matter, and so to get that to compost, we want to add nitrogen. So we've got animal bedding here that is high in urea that we will add on top of that so that it helps to break that down. After layering nitrogen, we're going to put another layer of carbon down by adding these dried ornamental grasses. So the last layer we're going to add is about 6 inches of good garden soil, and this is what we're going to plant in a little later. This is what will anchor those roots in, and it's the organic matter that's underneath there that's going to provide the nutrients and the moisture to those roots. adding our 6 inches of soil onto the top of all of our organic matter in the keyhole garden, and now it's time to fill up our compost bin. And you're going to treat this like a regular compost pile. The only thing is you'll never have to move this. The nutrients, as it breaks down, goes into the raised bed around it. And that's why we've bermed our soil towards the compost pile. Again, also to help with water flow away from the compost. So we're going to first add some dry leaves into this. It's always important to layer your carbon and also your nitrogen-rich material, such as this grass clipping here. So now that we've added the dry leaves, we're going to put some green grass clippings on top of that. And this will help that composting process. After the green grass clippings, we're also going to add some kitchen waste here. We have bananas, old tea bags, old coffee filters and such. And I like to put that kind of lower in the compost pile just in case you have any animals. The nice thing about this cage again is it will keep those animals from getting in there. After our green layer, we're going to go back in with what we call brown material. In this case, it's shredded paper, but basically it's our carbon. So again, this will create more of an interface between the nitrogen of the grass and this dried paper. So the last thing we're going to add to our compost pile is some green material that we actually just took some cuttings out of the greenhouse. There's no diseases or insects on these, and so they're really good to compost. So we're going to add those back into the garden. After you've completed the build of your keyhole garden, you want to make sure everything is nice and watered in, including the compost pile. So when we finish this, we watered it in really well, and we want to make sure that it does stay moist for a while so that we know that that cardboard and everything is nice and saturated. And we will be planting this pretty soon, but there's one more thing we want to do first, and that's to cover up this keyhole entrance. Right now it has grass growing underneath here, and we're simply going to take some of this leftover cardboard and cover that grass to prevent it from growing up. And the reason why we're wanting to do this is it's going to be a maintenance nightmare to have to get a weed eater in here, or it's too small really to get a lawnmower in here to mow that grass. Plus this will help prevent that grass from getting into the raised bed also. So after putting cardboard down, we're simply going to cover this up with mulch, and it'll create a nice mulch path into our compost pile. Now that we have this little cutout mulch, our keyhole garden is completed, and we're really excited to get it planted. Everyone loves low maintenance plants, and while every plant requires some amount of care, ornamental grasses are probably one of the low maintenance plants you can have in the garden. Now, they do require a little bit of attention in the late winter, early spring, and that's because they've got all of this dried material on top. Now, we like this during the winter time because, one, it provides protection to the crown of the plant, but also we enjoy seeing the texture as winter interest. We do need to cut this back now though, allowing for that new growth to come on. And so in order to do that, we're going to cut it about 3 or 4 inches above the crown of the plant. So what we're going to use, you can either use shears, or you can use something electrical or gas. We always want to make sure that we've got our safety equipment on, so we've got our glasses and also our gloves to do this. Now this works, shears work great if you're doing just 1 or 2 plants, but if you have a lot of them like we do here at the gardens, you might want to opt for something with a little more power. Now you can see we've tied ours up, and this makes it easy for collecting it and taking it to the compost. We're actually going to take ours and give it to the chickens. It also makes it nice when you tie it up so that when there's wind, it kind of contains it a little bit. It picks it up out of the way so you can see where you're cutting, and you don't have to go chasing it down with the rake. After we've cut away the old foliage, what we're going to do next is take a look at the crown of the plant. And you can see that this switchgrass, it's a clump forming grass. And so what tends to happen on these is the center dies out. You can see here that there's really no active growing tissue here in the center. So what we're going to want to do is divide this. Now this is a large grass clump to divide, so we're probably not going to be able to dig up the whole thing. We're just going to dig up sections of it, and those will act like individual divisions that we can then take and replant somewhere else. Now before you start digging, you always want to make sure that you're aware of any irrigation that's around. So we want to make sure that we find those lines, and there's one going right through this grass here, and that we don't cut those. When you dig, a sharp spade is always nice to use, and you want to make sure to go deep enough that you're getting a good amount of that root ball. You can see here that we had a large clump of grass that we were working with, and instead of digging up the whole root ball, which would have been too hard to handle, we've actually just dug a section of it up. You want to just get in there and be aggressive about cutting through that root ball because it's got quite a bit of roots. Now what we're going to do, we could take this and plant it, and it would be another plant somewhere else, or we can actually cut it in half and have two more plants. If you were to dig up an ornamental grass, the whole root ball being this size, you could take it and quarter it or half it, depending on how many more plants you would want, but you have plenty of crown here to get a couple of more plants out of this. We have here another clump forming grass. This is a miscanthus, and it hasn't been divided in quite a while, so you can see that once again there's a center that has died out on it. Now if you're tired of breaking your shovels trying to dig these root balls up and divide these grasses, you might be interested in our next little experiment that we're going to do. Now we've heard that you can actually take an auger and drill out the center of this grass and then put fresh soil in there, and what that does is that digs out some of the old roots and it gets some of the old soil out, puts fresh soil in there, and it allows that grass to grow back into the center. So we're going to try this and take a look at it in a year and see if the grass has started growing back to the center. This winter we've endured a few ice storms, and while we're not out of the woods yet, we need to start looking at some of those trees that didn't fare so well this winter during those ice storms. When you're looking at a tree and determining whether you want to remove it or not, I'd like to say there's an easy way to determine that. Unfortunately, it can kind of be subjective based on whether you have some sentimental value with that tree. Now, there are a couple of factors you should consider, and the first being you want to look at your tree and see if there's any hazardous branches that could potentially fall down in the future, or if the tree itself has lost the integrity to be sound. The next thing you want to think about and look at is the shape of the canopy of the tree. If the canopy of the tree has lost over a third of it, you might consider removing that tree. The third thing to consider is how easy it is to replace that tree. Is it a fast-growing tree, and is it readily available in nurseries? Or maybe you really weren't that much of a fan of that tree and you want to consider getting something different. The fourth thing that you want to think about and look at is how much damage is done to the main trunk of the tree. If you look behind us, this tree has lost one of its leaders and has incurred significant damage to the trunk of the tree. Now, after you decide you want to remove a tree, you want to be honest with yourself and decide whether you can do it yourself or you need to hire somebody. When you hire an arborist, you want to make sure that they are ISA certified, and that stands for the International Society of Arboriculture, meaning you will know that your arborist that you're hiring will be doing the proper pruning procedures and also remove it safely. The other thing you want to make sure to ask your contractor is if they have insurance for any liability that might incur on your property. So we've determined that this tree needs to be removed, and we will be hiring professionals to do that. Here we have a tree that has a little less significant ice damage, but we have lost a branch, and you can see that branch ripped and created a fair amount of damage done to that branch right here. We're going to want to remove this branch just because anytime you have exposed surface area that's been ripped like that, it invites pathogens and potential decay into this tree. So we're going to make this a clean cut using the 3-cut method. And the way you want to do that, first of all, we're going to identify where the branch collar is. You can see it's the swollen area where the branch meets the trunk of the tree, and you don't want to cut into these cells. These are the cells that will actively grow and callus over once we remove this branch. What we're going to do is cut 3 different cuts on this branch to remove it properly. The first cut we're going to make is an undercut, and we're going to do this a couple of inches outside of this branch collar. So we're going to do this first. The next cut that we're going to make is outside on the top. We'll draw a line there so that you can see. And this is going to be our second cut, and we're going to cut all the way through the branch here. Now, the reason why we're doing this is because if we just made a cut through the branch, what would happen is the tissue on the bottom would tend to rip down into the trunk of the tree. And this again is what we want to prevent. So by making this first undercut, that tissue will only rip back to this cut here. Now the final cut that we're going to make is to clean off this here, and we will do that just outside of that branch collar. And again, we don't want to cut into those cells that are actively growing, because those are what's going to callus over and create a nice sealed wound. So if you're worried about making an improper cut, using this marker to write on here first is a great way to kind of see what you're going to do before you cut. Now, again, we're just going to follow the numbers. So we're going to make our first cut here. Safety first is always important. And the other thing is you want to make sure you have a nice sharp saw. So what we're going to do is just cut the undercut where that number 1 is. So now that we have the undercut done, and you don't have to saw all the way through on number 1. This is simply, again, to prevent that tissue from tearing down into the trunk of the tree. So now we'll move on to number 2, and we're going to cut this all the way through. Again, this is so we take the weight of the branch off of. So while this branch didn't rip all the way back to our cut, you can see how it did start to pull back, and that cut would prevent that bark from going all the way into the trunk of the tree. Now that we have the weight of the branch removed, we're going to make our final cut, and that's because we want to get this stub off of here. If we were to leave this, eventually this would start to decay and again create a spot for insects and pathogens to come into this tree. So we're going to finish with our third cut. And again, you don't want to cut into the branch collar, you want to cut just outside of that. Now we've successfully removed the branch off of this tree, and you can see that it's not flush. A lot of times people think you need to cut a branch flush with the trunk of the tree, and that's not always the case, because again, we want to make sure that we're cutting outside of that swollen branch collar. Again, these are the cells that are going to callus over this and heal this wound.
Next week, we'll be building a raised bed out of repurposed pallets. Casey will make beautiful arrangements by forcing branches of spring-blooming shrubs. And we'll build a hill of a raised bed. So join us next week for more TV you'll grow to love. To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We wish to thank our generous underwriters, TLC Garden Centers, Southwood Landscape and Garden Center, and the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is provided by Pond Pro Shops, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, and the Oklahoma Horticultural Society.